continue. Okay.
All right, we will call this study session to order. Tonight, we're going to be learning about the recycling program, which is a pretty big update, I think. And this will be presented by two folks from Metro, Pam Peck and Scott Clegg. Welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, Mayor Gamba. Good evening, Mayor Gamba and members of the council. Thank you so much for inviting us to be here tonight. My name is Pam Peck, and I'm the Policy and Compliance Program Director with Metro's Waste Prevention and Environmental Services Department. Tonight, Scott Clegg is with me. He's a senior planner at Metro who has spent an extensive amount of his career at Metro working on our state legislative work, and particularly around producer responsibility policies. So what we had planned for this evening is to really kind of step back and give you a bigger picture overview of what extended producer responsibility policies, kind of their origins, philosophy behind them, kind of a lay of the land, how local governments have been using these types of policies. Then, of course, we want to focus on the newly adopted Recycling Modernization Act, which is the most recent example adopted in Oregon. And then we'll also just share quick overviews of some of the other existing policies like this in Oregon, as well as some that we have been considered by the legislature and we expect will be considered in the upcoming sessions. We've designed this to be, this presentation to be as interactive as you would like it to be. So please, you can stop us if you have a question. We'll take a few pauses at places to check if you have questions kind of between those major chunks of content, but we can certainly, it's designed to adapt to meet your needs and answer your questions. So I'm going to cover a little bit of the beginning and talk about the Recycling Modernization Act as well. And Scott will talk about some of the other policies and upcoming policies. So in regard to like, what is it when we're talking about extended producer responsibility? Really at its most basic level, what it's about is making the folks who produce products, the manufacturers of those products, responsible for the end-of-life management and recycling of those products. And as you'll hear under Oregon's Recycling Modernization Act, they're also responsible for some other things as well. At its most simple level, if you make it, you take it, meaning you take it back and you make sure that it's dealt with properly. This is a key strategy that is in the regional waste plan, which really guides our work in the region around reducing waste and handling garbage and recycling. We see this as a key way to reduce the environmental and human health impacts of various types of waste. And as you'll hear today, this policy has been really, it started out being applied to more hazardous or toxic types of waste in sort of the earlier days. So historically, waste management has been a local responsibility, as you know. Started out very, very local with folks who are entrepreneurial and, were collecting scraps to feed their animals at their farms. That grew to the collection system we have today. But the products that we consume today are made all over the world. And so that basic system that in early days may have worked well when everybody was kind of making things closer to home. But it's really hard for it to be a local responsibility when you're dealing with the whole array of packaging and materials that come into people's lives, and when the problems that those things create are global in nature. And so it's really challenging for any local government to be responsible for making sure every one of these products is handled responsibly, just given their other scope of duties and the complexity of addressing all these different types of materials that we have today. So really, that's the basis of this policy, a recognition that producers actually need to take responsibility. It really stems from the idea of the polluter paying for the problems that they're creating. So all the problems that a product might cause, as the person who consumes that product, I'm going to bear those costs. The producer, of course, will pass those costs to me, but those costs aren't passed along to everybody else who may not use that type of product. And as you know, we have a lot of people in our communities who work really hard to do waste prevention, recycling, are careful about what they buy. So what this philosophy would say is why should they have to pay the cost because maybe I choose to buy all of these other things that are very expensive and difficult to dispose of. We saw the first policies emerging in Germany and in Canada. And there's different versions of producer responsibility for recycling across Canada. They're moving to a system where producers are fully responsible. And here in the US, Oregon is really one of the first examples because the Oregon Bottle Bill is a form of producer responsibility policy. So I want to just talk about a few of the basic terms that we'll talk about today and just distinctions that you'll hear in the kind of discussions. So when we talk about product stewardship, that's typically voluntary. So I make a product and I'm going to do the right thing and make a commitment to, reducing the impacts of how I make it or what have you. So that would be something that you would do voluntarily. And you see a lot of those claims and things and a lot of companies are doing things voluntarily. What extended producer responsibility does, though, is at a minimum, it creates some requirements for producers or obligations that they have to carry out for the end of life, basically for a product and its packaging. So there's really two key features of these policies. And the first is shifting both financial and management responsibility away from government and more to producers. So government still has oversight, sets goals, sets the standards for what's expected, but the producer then they have to work together to carry out and meet their obligations. And we'll share some examples of how that happens. This system also provides incentives for folks to do the right thing because basically it puts pricing signals in the right places. So producers join together to meet their obligations and they pay into an organization together, a nonprofit organization, to meet their obligations. And so as you'll see from some of these examples, so producers who are doing less impactful things. So in the example of the new Recycling Act, if you're producing packaging that's easy to recycle, isn't having as many impacts, you're going to pay less than somebody who's producing something that's like going to disrupt the system, gum up the works, you might say. You're going to pay a little bit more. So the idea is you're building incentives in there to have folks get to better packaging and better product design with fewer environmental and human health impacts. So Scott was just going to take over here and give you a little bit of the lay of the land around how these policies have really taken hold across the US.
Thank you, Pam. So yes, my name is Scott Clegg. I've been a planner, senior planner at Metro for a number of years and have for the last couple of decades been working on producer responsibility legislation in this state. And one of the roles I've taken on is that I'm on the board of the Product Stewardship Institute, which produced some of the materials that Pam has here and which we work with. These couple slides here are going to show how the growth of this EPRs in the estates have been. When I first started into this in about 2001 or so, there were about 10 producer responsibility laws. Almost all of those, I believe, were about batteries. This is the time of mercury there was mercury in batteries and that. So there were a couple state laws that were passed. And that's now grown to over 120 laws for 15 different products. Also, PSI is, as an organization, we are now have 47 states as members and many scores of local governments, including Metro. Next slide, Pam, please. So in terms of those products, here's sort of a high level view of what kind of is covered at this point. We have from the left, we have that's packaging. There's only 2 laws. Oregon and Maine became the first 2 states to have a law on that. There's several mattress. We'll talk a little bit about those, and then a variety of other ones. Oregon has, and we'll talk about these shortly. We were the first one to have a paint law. There are now almost a dozen. Also, the electronics, Oregon was amongst the first couple states to have one, an EPR law for take back on e-waste or e-scrap. There are now a couple dozen of those. So Oh, one of the things I did want to sort of call out was you don't see the bottle bills on this. I know it's hard to read, but one of the things is there are 10 bottle deposit return systems in the country, but they're all very different. Some of them are very government centric and controlled. California is a big example of that. Oregon's, by contrast, and I'll talk about that a little bit when we get to that, is pretty close. As Pam said, it's a precursor of EPR laws, even though it's 50 years now. But it does have some of the characteristics of industry being very responsible for the system and not just being a government program. Next slide, Pam. So in terms of what's making EPR catch on, and this really, in the time I've worked on it, we've seen tremendous growth in the number of laws and the number of products that are covered. And the reason is because it works. It provides, this is a good list of the benefits that EPR brings. Every EPR law is a little bit different. No product is the same. So how you collect it, who the producers are, you do have to tailor it for each of the product categories. But in terms of the benefits, they're remarkably similar. It provides for some of these products that are difficult to manage and recycle. It provides a source of sustainable financing. It builds up the infrastructure, educates the public, and provides oftentimes many more sites for people to take these materials or access to recycle them. So we get bumps to increased recovery, reuse, and recycling. It is a jobs provider. We've done some studies on various programs across the country, and it does provide jobs. It improves the efficiency of the system. A lot of the solid waste system is in different pieces. Different people collect different things. So this provides some harmony in what gets collected, and therefore makes it more possible to have economies of scale and collection in that, for example. And it does provide better products, as Pam talked about at the beginning. It tries to, by putting the cost of these programs on the producers, it does provide an incentive for them to develop better products with less life cycle impacts. That's been a hope and a promise of this. And lately we're seeing some new developments. We'll talk about that a little bit with the Oregon law, perhaps on packaging. But that is an important part of why we're doing this. Next slide, Pam. In terms of how these systems work, I think the best way to describe it is, Pam had that quote about, if you make it, you take it, but there's a little broader way of talking about that, which is, and the way these systems are set up legally is that if you sell a product into the state of Oregon or Washington, depending on where you're talking about, then you have to provide the end of life services generally, sometimes other things upstream, but that's the basic scheme, which is that if you sell it, you have to participate in an organization that's going to help pick it up. So the producers are responsible for doing this. They're responsible for, as I say, for providing some financing, as well as, depending on the product and the existing infrastructure and that, a role in managing these programs with state oversight, of course. We'll talk a little bit about the stewardship organizations that the manufacturers or the producers set up to help discharge their obligations and responsibilities. And then each of these programs, when they work well, has some goals, performance standards. The idea is to be performance oriented, that you set up goals for the industry to accomplish, and then you kind of step back. And since it is the private sector, you want to rely on them to utilize their skills and experience in in the logistics of providing these services and recycling these products. Convenience standards is a big part of the performance goals that are often set. We'll talk about that relative to some of the individual programs. Finally, the way it works is that there are these laws that are passed, the stewardship organizations that represents the manufacturers, the producers, have to submit a plan to the state, the DEQ in most cases, and then they oversee how that is implemented and judge it on that. So the next slide here, going to switch over to Pam, but these are the bills that we'll go over in a moment. These are the 4 currently operating EPR programs in the state. And we'll come back to those, but each of these are the steward for the products. You have the bottle bill overseeing the Oregon Recycles. These are nonprofits that are set up to oversee these programs. And then in the case of Drug Take Back, which just got started, there are actually 2 producer organizations. But at this point, I'll pass it back to Pam, and she's going to talk about the newest addition to EPR in the state, and that's the packaging legislation. Pam?
Yeah, before I do that, are there any questions at this point before I start talking about that specific bill? Okay, I will go forward into the, so the Oregon legislature adopted the Plastics Pollution and Recycling Modernization Act in their last session. And this bill was the outcome of a collaborative process that was convened at the state level. And there was a steering committee that was established about 3 years before the legislation was actually introduced in the legislature. And I had the good fortune to sit on that committee representing Metro. There were quite a number of local government representatives on the committee, both from the county level, the city level. The League of Cities was also represented, the Association of Oregon Counties, and then kind of all the types of businesses involved in recycling in Oregon were involved in the group as well. So that group was formed because of all the problems we were having in our recycling system. Essentially, the system that we had in Oregon really wasn't updated and able to, or I should say now, because we're still with that system, right? Our system was created many years ago when our manufacturing ecosystem was a lot different, when we were making more products in Oregon, and significantly when we were actually producing more wood and paper products in Oregon, because much of the paper we consumed could be recycled. And so, right, so many things have changed. There's so much less paper. There aren't as many paper mills. Our products are largely made outside of the state now. And we have so many kinds of plastic that have come into our lives. And so the system was really challenged to handle that. The other thing that we had seen with all that proliferation of new packaging is that it's really confusing for people to figure out what goes in the recycling bin for a number of reasons. Misleading labels are one of them. So you'll see the recycling symbol is on things. It doesn't mean that they're recyclable. It just means it's a certain type of plastic, for example. Claims of recyclability, compostability, and those kinds of things driving people's decision to put it in. And we know from research we've done, people just want to be able to make a quick and fast and easy decision. Recycling, they don't want recycling to take over their lives. They're in the middle of their busy life, cooking dinner, whatever it is they're doing, they want it to be easy to know where to go. So what we were seeing is lots of garbage mixed in with our recycling, challenges for sorting that garbage out with the kind of equipment at our sorting facilities. And you probably heard in 2017 that one of the primary end markets or recipients of our material, which was the country of China. And they said, hey, there is too much garbage in this recycling and our communities don't want to take all this garbage. And so you probably heard about that crisis, which really impacted the markets. And then recycling started to, so some markets closed to our recycling. Other markets started to open, but really weren't set up to appropriately handle the materials either. So you've probably seen, if you've seen the story of plastics or saw maybe the Frontline episode about plastics recycling. So lots of issues there, not just in Oregon, but really across the nation for dealing with this type of packaging. So we had an outdated system, public very confused, and then costs continuing to go up for local government. So those were just some of the problems that we wrestled with in developing a proposal to go to the legislature. And the bill, the Plastics Pollution and Recycling Modernization Act, is a very comprehensive overhaul of the recycling system. And it includes producer responsibility elements and really a lot more. And so the new law will become effective next year in January, but the system won't be fully implemented until 2025. So I'm just going to talk about a few of the key features of this and how it will work. So the bill will support more public education, and there'll also be one statewide collection list. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that is going to be developed. The bill includes significant equity components, and that was something that folks from this region, Metro and the cities in this region worked really hard to get into the bill. Because what we know is that for people who live in multifamily homes, like apartments and condominiums, they have not had recycling services on par with what folks in single family homes have. In addition, as that market crisis affected communities across Oregon who are further from the Portland metro area, they just couldn't afford to participate. So rather than increasing rates at levels they didn't feel they could, they simply just removed a lot of items from their recycling lists. There's also other parts of Oregon that historically just haven't had much recycling service. So the idea was to address those needs of both underserved and unserved communities through the bill. The bill does include producer obligations, but it's not 100%. Producers are not obligated to do everything in this system. So it's a little bit different than some of the other policies that we'll discuss today. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But what the producers are most importantly obligated to do is to support those increased costs that we will have as we modernize the system. So for example, as we bring as our sorting facilities, the material recovery facilities that sort the materials, as they look at the equipment that they need to handle the kinds of plastics and other things in our lives today, the producers will be obligated to help support those improvements. Producers are also obligated under this to ensure that we have responsible end markets for our recycling. So that's a big issue that came up through the committee process, and we hear a lot about from the public. We know that right now, over half the paper that is recycled from our area is going to markets that are outside of the United States and Asia, and about a third of our plastic. We really do not know a lot more than that. There's a real lack of transparency in the system today. And so we can't be assured that everything that is going, especially when it's going out of the United States, where we really can't follow it, we really can't be assured of exactly what's happening. And this is not the fault of the countries receiving these materials. This is definitely the fault of the country sending these materials, because as I mentioned, it's not just the United States, but all over the world, folks were sending a lot of garbage to places that can't handle it. So producers are obligated under this system for an item to be included on the new statewide list. There will have to be a market that it can go to that is responsible, that can handle it without adverse environmental, human, and social negative impacts, as we've seen with some of the ways plastics are impacting folks around the world who are on the receiving end of our recycling. Under the law, recycling should become easier for folks as it becomes more accessible. And so there's a component of the bill that is one of the first things that's happening is there's a truth in labeling task force that's looking at the issue of recycling labels. That turned out to be one of the most controversial things in this whole process. And of course, producers have concerns about different labeling requirements all over the United States and would prefer to see something more harmonized. But it was interesting to see that's where we had probably a great deal of pushback. So there's a task force that's one of the first rulemaking actions under this to really look at how to address the truth in labeling. And the bill includes an oversight, and I'll talk a little bit more, just so we can be assured that the system is going forward as it should. So this slide gives you a little bit of a snapshot of how the system will work, and I'll talk a little bit about roles for various folks in the system. So kind of on the left of the slide, so these producers who are making all the different paper and packaging that's coming into our lives, they have new obligations under this law. And so they will need to band together and create one or two, whatever they want to do, nonprofit groups to carry out these obligations. They'll then work to develop a plan to carry out their obligations. The other thing we'll have going on here is the development of a statewide collection list. And this is really key. As I mentioned earlier, we have different things we're collecting all around the state of Oregon. For communities that are outside the Portland area, it's been very expensive for them to bring materials into the Portland area for sorting. But the statewide collection list, it will look at what are the environmental benefits of recycling various things. So is there an environmental benefit to recycling this item? Does it make sense to recycle it? Is there a responsible place for it to go after we sort it out here to be recycled? And then the other thing that this process will look at is how best should that item be collected? So is it the kind of item that can be collected through your franchised haulers and just added to the blue bin or some other way that they can collect it on their route? Or is there something else that needs to be set up? And styrofoam is a great example of that. Styrofoam creates a tremendous mess if you try to put it into your blue bin. Just imagine how it breaks down and little pieces are blowing around and they're all blowing around the neighborhood once somebody's bin falls over, right? So styrofoam is an example of something that wouldn't be collected in a route truck, but could be collected through a system of recycling depots or other convenient ways. So that is one of the things producers will be obligated to do, is to support those depots for materials that can't be collected en route. So then after the statewide list is developed, we'll see an expansion of recycling services, but that will be at the local level. So the idea is that each community then will have the support it needs. So if you're a community that had reduced your list, you'll be able to add the things back in that are with the statewide list. And there'll be support from producers for some of that program expansion. In regard to people that live in multifamily homes, I just want to note that the bill calls for a study to look at what resources are needed to improve services for multifamily recycling. In this region, we have a pretty good idea of that because metro and area local governments have been working together for the past few years to improve those services. And we have new service standards for people who live in multifamily homes for both their recycling and garbage and their bulky waste that will all be implemented over the next few years as cities bring them into their franchise agreements and things. So what we really want to get out of this is some financial support for especially the recycling enclosure areas. So, and especially for housing, affordable housing, or where there may be challenges for a developer or somebody to add the appropriate recycling enclosure or to update. So that's an issue we'll be particularly watching and following during the rulemaking. Local governments will continue to play their role in being in charge of collection, and you'll continue to play your role in being in charge of education. A couple of things that will be different for education is that producers will be expected to create some basic educational materials and in multiple languages about that statewide collection list. So everybody doesn't have to at the local level create their own basic materials and information. You could do more if you want to, but there'd be templated materials available for people. The other piece is that we know that getting the garbage out of the recycling, there are improvements we need to make to our sorting facilities, but there's also better information we need to give residents to help them sort better. So we call that contamination reduction education. And this region has a collaborative program called Recycle or Not that Clackamas County helps to, they participated in the development of that because as I'm sure you know, they carry out the recycling and waste reduction education in your area. And they've done some work around giving people feedback directly in their bin. So you get like a little gold star, you did it right, or a little note, hey, don't put this in the bin. So programs like that are very effective, but they are also expensive. So, so the producers will be obligated to help support those programs, which creates another incentive for better labeling and materials that are more easily sorted sort of over time. So that is one of the issues that we'll be working through more in rulemaking, but the bill obligates them to reimburse local governments for those education activities. I already talked a little bit about responsible end markets. That's one of the obligations of producers to identify those if the folks sorting the materials can't find them. And then there'll be an oversight, and I'll talk a little bit more about the sorting facilities in a second. And then there'll be an oversight board. So that was one of the things that was worked through during the legislative process. That was a really important piece to everybody, that we have that oversight there. And so in addition to, so this is different from some of the other bills, there'll be a state board that's formed. There are, I believe, 4 seats on that for local government, and we're really encouraging local governments in our area to consider applying. All of the local governments around the state worked very effectively together in a coalition to pass this bill. And so it's really important that we're involved in the multi-years of rulemaking that'll happen over the next couple of years to make sure that these obligations and these ratepayer protections are carried out in the fine details. There also are seats on this board for community members too, and for small businesses. So just wanted to flag that as well. And the applications are due on November 19th for folks who are interested in getting engaged in that oversight process. And just really briefly, last thing I wanted to mention is that in regard to how materials are sorted, the sorting facilities will have to be permitted under the law within the state to ensure that they can actually sort things effectively. And then sorting facilities outside the state will have to be certified by the state so that we know they can sort effectively and that they're using those responsible end markets that were identified and approved in the plan. So those are basically the kind of performance standards I'm talking about. And so local governments will only be able to send their materials to these certified MRFs, because basically every one of them, I'm sorry, I'm using jargon, but material recovery facility, every single one of them in the state is going to be pretty motivated to get this certification. So those were all the things specifically about this bill, and maybe just this would be a good time to pause here again, because next what we were going to do is talk about some of the other examples of this type of policy in the state, and then some of the new ones that have been under development.
Anybody?
Yeah, I had a couple questions.
Go ahead, Lisa.
You said the applications for the state oversight board are being taken through November 19th. In addition to the 4 seats for local governments, there's, I assume, other kinds of seats on that. We might have people in our community who, aren't on the city council, but
Yes.
be interested in serving.
Yeah, there are seats for community members and small businesses and industry. So there's lots of different ways to participate.
And where do we find the info on those applications?
That is, I can get that link to you, but it's actually, there's one place on the state's website where for all the state boards that you go to apply, but we could send you that as a follow-up.
Okay, that'd be great. I just want to say, I heard you talk about alternative ways of looking at the collection methods, and that not everything can be collected at the curb. And I've always wondered why we don't have more drop-off depots. We've kind of come in a circle, right? We used to have only drop-off depots. And things like, batteries, you both mentioned batteries, drive me crazy. Because I know there's a few places, I think IKEA will take my batteries back, and a few places, but I have a bucket full of batteries, and I come down to the Oregon City transfer station about every 3 years with my batteries and my LED bulbs or my compact fluorescent bulbs. And I've always thought there should be localized, smaller drop-off places for these kind of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And there were more recycling depots, as you noted, even more recently, but they became expensive for folks to operate. And then I think when the markets became unstable, also some of the Far West Recycling used to have one that they ended up closing down, and the city of Portland used to have one that they closed down. We do take some things at Metro South, but clearly we need to have a lot more convenient options for people, as you know.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
It feels frustrating that, it's not like this is some big surprise thing that nobody saw coming. It feels frustrating that the rulemaking and the program setup is going to take as long as it's going to take. Is it simply because the manufacturers are pushing back so hard, or LOC. I can imagine that LOC might be pushing back on this too.
Well, there were elements that were delayed, definitely because of the feedback for, so as I said, like on the multifamily homes, right, that there's a study instead of a set amount of money in the bill, which is what we wanted to see. Also, I didn't mention, there's some components in the bill to address plastic litter that producers are obligated for, and those were pushed further out. But the rulemaking will be complex. So yeah, I don't know if Scott, if you have any more comments you want to make in addition to what I just said.
Yeah, as I've been working on it so long, these do take a while, and I do get frustrated about that very fact. But I'll talk a little bit about a couple of the other bills that passed, and we are trying to look forward into the future, what other products might be taken on these systems. And I know I'm trying to figure out, is there some way to make this happen a little more? Because it takes a long time to get through the legislature, and it takes a while to make the rules, and then you have to turn to the manufacturers who have to submit their plans. So timelines get stretched out. It's frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, that's why to me, this little piece is so frustrating, because we should be hitting things like anti-designed obsolescence laws and cradle to cradle laws and stuff like that's where the long work should be right now, not recycling the little dribs and drabs that we're recycling right now.
There is some long work that's embedded in the new Senate Bill 582. One thing that I kind of alluded to was how do you work the upstream aspect, make people design things better. And there's a requirement that the manufacturers of the packaging, at least, have to start thinking about the whole life cycle and redesign. That's in the, and to charge each other in this programs that they have for, if it has a better life cycle output, it should, or lighter footprint, then they should be encouraging that when they work with each other. If it's more expensive, then they should be charging each other. And there are, they call them eco-modulated fees, which is quite a mouthful, but the idea is that if you have something that's particularly difficult to recycle, it should cost more, it should cost the manufacturers more. Part of what goes on in these programs, because they're new in this country, things are a little moving ahead in Europe and in Canada, but it's all been, everything gets collected and put in one pool. So the signal back to the individual producer hasn't been particularly strong. And some of these new things like eco-modulation is a way to try and send that signal upstream to the individual manufacturer.
Yeah, I think Japan is another place, although they haven't quite gotten to the anti-designed obsolescence point. They're getting really close, where they have essentially a ratcheting up of quality. The quality, everyone has to hit the standard of the best, the highest quality products. So it's a really interesting system, which should continue to ratchet up products out of Japan.
Yeah, I think the ratcheting is they're known in the business, so to speak, here of showing some real effects on stuff. In this country, we do have, you know, some of the standards for appliances and things like that. Those have ratchet things in them, that things get better over time, but they aren't requirements. They're sort of voluntary. But those kind of schemes people have been thinking about how to do that, but putting it in legislation has been difficult.
Yeah, no, thinking back, my mother had the same washer and dryer my entire life, like the entire time I lived with my parents. She had the same washer and dryer. And in my adulthood, I think I've gone through 2 sets.
Yeah,
because they just become unrepairable after a certain point. And what else are you going to do? And it's not like, it's not like the materials and the cleverness of engineers has gone worse. if anything, it's because the manufacturer is saying, hey, we can't sell as many washers and dryers if you're making them so good. So stop making them so good.
Yeah,
True.
one other point I wanted to make just about the timeline is that, and it's relevant to this slide that's up on the screen right now. So the facilities that sort the recyclables that are generated in our region and most of the state are actually located within the Portland metro area. And they're under license to Metro because their facilities, right, have impacts on the communities they're in, and because we're responsible for making sure waste is handled properly in our region, and that includes recycling. So with the recycling steering committee, that consensus process I mentioned, one of the recommendations that group made is that Metro should look at what we can do in the interim before the state law is adopted. Are there things we could add to our current license requirements? So we do have a project ongoing now in collaboration with DEQ. We'll be bringing some concepts to our council in early January, but for example, of improving the reporting so people could have more transparency to know what happens to the things they're putting in the bin. That would be something, that's one of the things that potentially could happen earlier than this law. So anyway, we are looking at that. And then the other thing our council has asked us to do is to really make sure we've identified, the benchmarks, what we want to see coming out of this bill to make sure that those things happen in the rulemaking and to look for local options if they don't, essentially. So we'll be keeping a close eye, on that, and of course being in touch with everyone else in the region about that too. Scott, do you want to?
Yeah, why don't you jump ahead to the next slide and I'll go through these a little quickly.
Because time check, we have like 15 more minutes. Is
Yeah,
that correct?
I can do these in a couple of minutes, but the important point about them is these are the 4 different programs we have, and there's a lot of history here. I won't go deep into that, but it does touch on those questions of, boy, it takes a while to do this. Why is it so complicated on that? And I think we're learning, we're getting better. Each bill we do gets a little bit easier. The industry gets to understand. It's not so foreign to them. So first of all, the bottle bill. Like I said, this is something that I view Oregon's one as being a pretty good precursor to producer responsibility. Modern producer responsibility was passed 50 years ago. It's the 50th anniversary. One of the things was that, it was a reaction to these no deposit, no return cans and bottles that were showing up. It was time of the Oregon environmental ethos being developed with the beach bill passing a couple years before that. But it became very difficult to change it. And that's really a trick here. How do you have these legislation that you can add things to? It took until 2007. There were some private NGO attempts, non-governmental organizations attempt to expand it that didn't work. It was very difficult to change. There was eventually a task force and water was added in 2007. And that really was a game changer because that changed the distribution. Because what this thing is an industry run. Is you go back, it comes from the old return to the grocery stores and return to the taverns, going back to the for refilling in that. So the real change came in 2007, which shook things up such that we had now a statewide producer organization, OBRC, Oregon Beverage Recycling Corporation, co-op, which runs the program. That became, when they got established statewide and started on their plan to develop these drop centers, depots, bottle drops all around the state. They've also adopted these new return, the bags that you can take back and leave at a center of a fast drop. And they've always got great quality in the materials because the stuff separated to begin with doesn't get mixed up with the other trash. And they're even taken to starting up a program to work on refillables for beer, but I've also heard some things about looking at wine bottles too. So second slide here, Oregon e-cycles. Oregon and Washington were the first states. This is one where Local governments really were trying to step up and do this. We looked at what was happening back in Hennepin County in Minnesota. They were similar to us. They were looking at $1 million a year in costs. So we really tried. It was good to have local governments work and provide these services, but we always viewed it as an interim program. And then we eventually got this passed in Oregon. Oregon and Washington were the first ones to have this system, which now has about 300 collection sites in the state and takes.
I think Scott just froze.
Yeah.
Okay, so you can see it takes TVs, computers, printers, and peripherals. I'm going to move us to the next one. Are you unfrozen? You were frozen. All right, you're unfrozen.
Oh, it just says, okay, we'll move on. So it was a two-part. It didn't even show. I got a little bleep, but anyways. So we went on, and then Paint Care came about. There was a national dialogue, PSI, that I mentioned before, the Product Stewardship Institute, got all the states together. Oregon adopted it first. It failed a couple times in Minnesota. They didn't quite understand what it was. So now we have a site that, we have a program that's got, over 170 collection sites and collects nearly 1 million gallons a year of paint and processes it. Metro, in this case, we now work for the paint organization, and they bring us paint and we process it. So overall, it saves us about another $1 million a year. So next slide.
Yeah, right. It was spinach soup for dinner.
The drug take back program. This one, I'm happy to say, actually from passage to implementation was a pretty good thing. It only took like 2 years here. So it actually got started in July of this year. There are a number of sites around the state, several hundred, that accept now your prescription and non-prescription drugs. You don't have to go to a special event with an officer or a sheriff at it. There are also prepaid envelopes for some of the parts of the state where they don't have the drop-off sites. In this case, we actually have 2 producer organizations. They actually have separate sites right now where you can find, but eventually this fall, they're going to be, one stop. You can go online and find out where you can take your medicines. One of the disappointments here is that we didn't get a program that also took sharps. So maybe in the future that might happen. Next slide, Pam. So in terms of legislation in 2021, there were a number of things there. One of the things that might be of interest based on talking about the appliances stuff is that there was a right to repair legislation that would enable you to have access to the schematics and that for a variety of products, mainly smart electronics, not necessarily washing machines and dryers and that, but anything that was really a kind of a smart appliance has a circuit board in it and that, which is mostly phones and things like that, so that you could repair them yourself or go to a shop and have them more easily repaired. That we won't probably see in 22, maybe in 23. Metro has been pushing a household hazardous waste bill that would require the manufacturers to help pony up for what we've been doing for decades now. That's been stalled in a particular committee in the legislature. So it's made it out of its policy committee, but it hasn't been able to get out of Ways and Means. And then last session, the first time we saw bills introduced for sharps, carpet, and for solar panels. Solar panels is an interesting one. You're trying to get out ahead of, right now, there's not necessarily a lot of end of life management. They tend to be reused in that. But that's a good example of trying to get ahead on things. Next slide. Well, one of the things we got really close with in the last session was a bill for mattresses. There are 3 other bills in the country. These are very recyclable. It provides jobs for a lot of folks. And most of the material in a mattress is, a typical mattress is recyclable. The bill just got kind of caught up in a mix-up of communication, and we're going to see it introduced next session. And we have high hopes that it's going to get passed in the short session next year. Next slide. So I'll turn it back to Pam to talk a little bit about some concluding observations and other questions you might have.
Yeah, I think, hopefully, as you can see from this presentation, that local communities have really played a critical role in advancing these policies in the United States. And that really actually is a market-based approach that really leverages the knowledge and expertise of industry, obligates them to use that knowledge and expertise to take care of their products throughout the life rather than forcing that on the rest of us. Household hazardous waste is a great example of that. In regard to, those products are very expensive to dispose of. And we certainly know there's times people need to use things like that, but other times when there's certainly a lot of other options that aren't used. And so having the producers help support that, because right now those costs are all ratepayers in the region pay for household hazardous waste services, that disposal is a cost spread across everybody in the region. So that's an example of why we think that would be a good idea. But as Scott noted, that's a bill that has not been able to get out of Ways and Means. And just the last thing I'll say is all these bills do go to Ways and Means because they have a temporary financial impact on the state, because the state has to hire the first staff person, and then the producers start reimbursing the state for those costs. But there's still, unfortunately, that mattress bill had had consensus support from industry and all the people involved in developing it. And so that was just really disappointing to see that one not pass this year. But we believe Senator Manning will be bringing that forward in the 22 session. So that's really, I'm going to stop the share. I know we're close to the end, and just see, are there other questions you have or additional information that would be helpful that we could provide?
Well, if no one has any questions, I'll just comment that, unfortunately, Councillor Heisey isn't with us tonight, but she was the one, I think, monitoring this more than any of us last term. Do let us know when there's something moving in the short session that it would be useful for us to chime in on.
Absolutely. And we'd be absolutely happy to meet with her, absolutely happy to meet with her and talk with her about this presentation as well.
We have a core of, things have been a little different in COVID. They haven't been they haven't been there, but we generally have a recycling, master recyclers at our farmers market. And we have a definite core of, and we have a citizen-led recycling, styrofoam recycling depot. So we definitely have people in our community who are interested in these issues. And, I think we could generate some support. So
great.
Well, I know the right to repair, we're a little disappointed to hear it. Probably not going to run in the short session because that's one where we think a good show of support from the local governments would be very effective and helpful. A lot of citizens are interested in that, and there's a lot of corporate lobbying against it.
Small businesses too, so independent repair shops would really benefit from right to repair passing, so they could have access to the manuals and parts and things to be able to repair things in their communities.
Right.
Are they saying that's just too complicated for a short session? Is that the excuse they're using for why they're not bringing it up?
Too intensive a session. A lot of you're not supposed to do new policy. This was a bill that actually was heard before, but there's a lot of musical chairs going on, different people and sponsors. So it's just kind of hard to get a fix on what they're willing to pass and not. I don't know. I still hold out hope that some things may get filed, and then there may be an opportunity to move something. Probably not though, because the sponsor doesn't want to move this one this term.
I think Oregon needs to get over this short session, long session thing.
Yes.
It's an anachronism of 100 years ago.
Well, I think we're lucky we got the second session. I mean, we got the session. For a while, there was just all special sessions,
Yeah.
you know. That was even worse. That was twice as bad, worse.
Well, does anybody else have any questions? This has been great. I mean, it's exciting, slow but exciting that this stuff is happening. You know, it's one of the many. When we did our climate action plan, we recognized that literally half of the climate impact of people of the city of Milwaukee, people in Milwaukee, was the stuff they buy. And I think the more things we can put in place that reduce that, whether it's on our end with tool libraries or, you know, cradle to cradle, all those kinds of things,
Mhm.
it will start to make a difference.
DEQ's just recently started a Facebook page for food waste, like trying to, you know, teach better tips on how to store food and stuff and reduce food waste. Yeah, which is interesting. I wouldn't have thought of that as DEQ, but I guess great.
Yeah, I don't know who that would be.
We've
Yeah,
had a local effort aimed at food generating businesses
Mhm.
called Food Waste Stops With Me, that many businesses in, actually the Bomber has been featured in that campaign for all of their great things they've done. But there hasn't really, and a couple of communities had programs aimed at households. But because reducing food waste is one of the most significant things to address climate, I think that's why DEQ actually did a lot of research to develop that "Don't Be a Bad Apple" campaign, or something like, it's called something like that. It's kind of catchy.
Mhm.
Well, thank you for coming. I second what the mayor said. It's been very informative because it wasn't, I mean, I knew there was this bill out there, but I didn't know exactly what it did. So it's very helpful to know.
Yeah, you're welcome. It was great too. We always love it when
Thank
people
you.
are interested in talking about policy. So thanks so much for inviting us here to talk with you. And if you have any more questions, please let us know. And we'll follow up and send your Scott S. We will send him the link for the for applying to be on that advisory board.
great, thank you.
Sure. And any
Right.
other questions you have about any particular bills, always glad to provide info.
Okay, appreciate that, thanks.
All right, thank you.
Thank you all.
So that's all we had on the agenda for this evening, right?
It is. So we can talk about it. Historically, there has been a push to only have one topic per study session. And this was a request from council to have them come talk. So that was the content. But if you want to do it differently, we're happy to. It's up to you.
Yeah, it's kind of nice to have an early evening every now and then.
Totally.
All right, well, see you all. Actually, I'll see some of you tomorrow.
Bye.
Bye.